right, welcome to the Engaging People podcast. We're doing a subset of our podcast series where we're going to focus on case studies. This could be a little different format. This is just Christian and I kind of having a conversation about some of our favorite clients and organizations that we admire, primarily because they have business success that's been driven by their people success. So today, Christian and I are going to chat about we're kind of fanboys of Danny Meyer. Tell us a little bit about Danny, Christian.
Well, Danny is a restaurateur that I didn't even realize I was a patron. I fell in love with Shake Shack. That's probably the best known global brand that he's got. But I fell in love with the experience and the food at Shake Shack many years ago, and I've eaten at probably 30 plus of their locations just because we get to travel a lot in our industry, and so we get to explore different cities, and there's usually a Shake Shack nowadays. And it wasn't until later I actually started reading more about Danny Meyer, the man behind that, as well as these other restaurants, and he's been wildly successful in this field. And the reason I think you and I are fans of Danny and his restaurants is not only are we big fans of food, but he's a really great example of someone who's winning through people and culture.
Yeah, that's for sure. It's funny, you talk about Shake Shack, but he actually got his roots in the 90s, opening up some really successful restaurants that were different than, fine dining back then. Union Square Cafe and Gramercy Tavern were the first two, and they offered a completely different experience. Danny realized he was in the experience business, not necessarily just the food experience, and so he was quite successful, and then eventually came Shake Shack. I love the story of Shake Shack because it was this nonprofit. He just put kind of this austere little shack in Madison Square Park in New York City in the Flatiron District, and the rent and some of the proceeds from that went to develop and keep that park going. And they had lines out the door, and because it's great food, right? He took the principles of high-end restaurant practice, and he built Shake Shack on it. Meaning, when you have a hamburger at Shake Shack, you're having a really great experience because it's the best bread, the best meat, and so on. So yeah, we are fans of Danny Meyer. So talk to me a little bit about Meyer's business challenges. As he's grown, he's kind of talked about the challenges that he faced, and they have been people challenges.
Yeah, I think he encountered something that I can only imagine in my nightmares, just the complexity of opening a restaurant and dealing with all the variables that go into play there. And initially where he was focusing on kind of these higher end establishments, the level of detail and attention to quality that's necessary is just astounding. And so he did encounter very quickly encountered some challenges, those complexities. And he dialed in very quickly on, we're not building a service culture, we're building a hospitality culture. And I think, one of the quotes that I picked up somewhere in just kind of listening to different podcasts and reading about Danny, one of the quotes I kind of latched onto is, he said early, I realize that how we treat each other is everything. If we do that well, everything else will fall into place. And so, to be able to focus on that in the fray of all the other problems you're solving and the immediate urgent things that are right on your plate is pretty incredible. And I think that's really what has set him apart.
Yeah, you look at his first location, Union Square Cafe, he really talked about how he understood the difference between service, which everyone sort of gets and can mimic, and hospitality. And that restaurant was built to be a completely different experience. But then he had to figure out how to take that culture he had worked so hard on and do it at Gramercy Tavern.
Yeah.
And then eventually his biggest challenge was to do it at Shake Shack, where they're growing. They've got multiple locations in development all at once, and they're worldwide. And he talks about how he gets there. But those are some impressive challenges. Is how do you take a culture and institutionalize it almost?
Well, and I think it's interesting. We see a lot of special organizations, and a lot of times it's special because they can be tied down to just the presence and the experience created by one man or woman at the top, just the kind of a one-person culture factory. And that's hard to scale. And it's hard if you want to open that second restaurant and you can't be there. how do you do that? And you really have to focus on culture and tuning and being very deliberate about culture if you want to expand. One thing I've learned in years of OD consulting is you can't legislate behavior. You can't build a policy that creates culture. Your policies can reinforce and support and things like that, but there's more to it than just writing down a vision statement or these are our values and then just hoping they'll take hold. There's a lot more to cultivate and shape a culture to expand and scale beyond what one person can create.
Yeah, one of the things we talk about a lot is as you try to build the right employee experience and you try to have success, culture is the way that you can get your employees, as you noted, to act autonomously and almost instinctually, right? They know what to do because the culture is there guiding them.
Yeah. Well, and some of the best stories about Danny, I think both of us have kind of latched onto are the things that happen spontaneously in his restaurants where a server or some member of the staff saw a need and just reacted in a way that created the right experience. And it wasn't something that you can train for, specifically. Here's what's going to happen when, something good or bad, or someone comes from out of town with a unique circumstance and you want to create a special experience for them. There's no playbook for all that. You have to create a culture that allows them to have that autonomy to act in a way that's aligned with a bigger vision and a feel.
Danny talks about one time when he was early on, he said, I think he just kind of hoped the culture would grow. And then he finally realized he went in one day and he says, I haven't done a very good job telling you what I expect, and that's going to change. And from now on, I'm going to tell you exactly what I expect. So you can't just hope that a culture will grow. He realized one of the tips we want you to take away from this is he got very deliberate.
Right.
And he started telling them, this is what we do. This is how we act. It came out of that salmon story.
Right.
Right. If you want to share that, if you remember it.
Right. A guest at one of his restaurants didn't enjoy a salmon dish, ate more than half of it, sent it back. And the server took it to the manager and said, well, what do we do? And they said, well, they ate more than half of it. We'll charge them. And the person received the bill, was really offended, wrote a letter to Danny. And Danny said, you know what? She's right. That's not the experience we want to create. And so even though the actions that the general manager took or the manager took, you can defend. It makes sense. They ate more than half. But that's not a hospitality mindset. It's not the culture. And so he really, that was kind of a catalyst for Danny to say, okay, I need to be more deliberate. He created some heuristics, these sayings that he would repeat and reinforce with examples anywhere he went, these Dannyisms and things like everyone here is hired to solve problems. And as well as he really shifted into, okay, what am I focusing on with culture? What can we control? How do we shape this so that we get the behaviors when there's not a set policy or procedure?
Yeah, humorous fact out of that story is, she was trying to hint that she didn't like it. And they ended up boxing it and sending it home with her.
That's right.
So, but that's when he learned, I have to be really clear with you about what our standards are.
Yeah.
And he talks about how he realized I can go get a lot of technically great people that know how to cook great food or prepare an environment that's just outstanding. But he talks about 6 emotional skills. We'd call these competencies in our business. But let's run through those because this is where he starts to pair these emotional skills with the technical skills, and he starts hiring specifically for the culture he wants.
Yeah, the 6 emotional skills that he called out are kind optimism, curious intelligence, empathy, work ethic, self-awareness, and integrity. So regardless of what you're being hired for as a technical role, it's a non-starter no matter how proficient you are if you don't also bring this to the table. And I love each of these, and I mean, we could talk for a long time about each of them, and we might. But there's another point to this. Something that I really admire about the approach is you control what you can control. Once someone's hired, it's much more difficult to build these things if they're not there. In a restaurant and in most organizations, we don't have a lot of time to slow down and stop and completely build character traits. And it's if that's even possible with some of these elements. So hiring for them, bringing them in from the get-go, and then reinforcing those and supporting that and helping leverage people's natural character traits to support the culture is really key.
One of the things I like that Danny talks about is this notion of motivation. Like, you could say, hey, I'm going to be a rah-rah manager or leader, and I'm going to try to foster kind optimism and empathy and all these things. But what he said is, look, if I go find these first, they're going to be intrinsically motivated already. I don't have to be this cheerleader coaxing them along. They're going to love what we do because this is who they are.
Right.
And that takes a lot of pressure off of Danny. All of a sudden, he's not having to be this constant babysitter of the culture. He's hiring natural fits. They start thriving, right?
It's almost like a flywheel keeps spinning, right? You hire for this type of attitude and approach. The culture becomes more of that. Those that kind of where that resonates with them find energy and enthusiasm, and the culture gets even stronger. And so this great hospitality energy and momentum that he was looking for really picks up and expands and allows him to do big things like move into however many countries Shake Shack's in now and expand and continuing to win more awards with his high-end establishments.
One of the things we ought to take a moment and just clarify is we've been talking a lot about culture, and culture is just the way things work around a place. We actually see employee experience as an extension of culture, right? Because we see it as the employee's culture through the eyes of the employee is the experience, right? And then finally, we talk about employee engagement. How does employee engagement tie back to this notion of culture and employee experience?
Yeah, so the culture is there. It's there whether you are deliberate or not. Hopefully, if it's you're taking an active role in shaping a positive culture to support business objectives and mission and vision, those types of things. The employee experience is essentially how the employees interact with that, how they experience your culture and everything about your organization. And then engagement is if they choose, based on that experience, if they choose to bring more of themselves to that work experience. And so if I have an employee experience and think, yes, I want to bring more of my energy and effort, I want to engage, that's kind of how the three terms that are often used interchangeably, but how they really relate and how we talk about them and build that with our clients.
Right, and from our perspective, Danny is doing all three.
Right.
He's the master of all three. He has a culture, he's deliberate about it, and then he's using that culture and that deliberate employee experience to drive that emotional reaction that those employees have. He may not have figured it out right from the beginning, but certainly at the end, it's what he talks about, and it's his big competitive advantage. I
often say you can't build employee engagement, you can only invite it. And the way you invite employee engagement is through the experience you're creating. And I think Danny's doing that in a big way. One, he's hiring people that are more likely to accept the invitation to engage in that environment. And then two, he's building a very compelling experience that once you're there, you want to dig in and you find energy in serving customers and that hospitality mindset.
One of the things I found was interesting is that he had some failures. He hasn't been successful in every type of adventure that he's been on. One was a restaurant named Tabla. It was an Indian cuisine, high end, and he just kept it going for a long time. 12 years, they kept fighting to keep it there. And there were some business reasons that it didn't work. It had like the bottom floor was what he called a bread bar, and the upper floor was a different menu, higher end, and people wanted to order across the menus, and he did some things that didn't make sense. One of the things he said, a lesson that he took away from keeping the restaurant probably open too long, is he said he was unfair to his employees. And you're like, well, you gave them a job, but he said really the problem is because they weren't succeeding, there weren't raises, people weren't growing, people weren't promoting. And he said, so I think he realized that one of the motivating factors that why people love to be part of Union Square Hospitality Group, which is his holding company, is that there's this path to being successful, to being awesome. And the people there at Tabla, they didn't have that.
Right.
They didn't have that. And so limited to no growth pathway meant that that in some ways it was part of it, kind of the reverse of a virtuous cycle. It was hurting itself because they're just kind of holding on, and if people are just always holding on, then they're not going to bring their best.
Yeah, and I think that's a lesson you can take, whether you're the founder or CEO, and all the way down to the team level. That people need to feel some sense of individual potential and growth and development, and that's often tied to the success of the group. Are we succeeding as a group? Are these opportunities going to come? And a lot of times we see groups, teams are succeeding, they're just not helping the employees see that. But this example of this restaurant that failed is a really interesting case study or moment in kind of the Danny Meyer evolution.
Yeah.
Because he's a driven guy, he's competitive, he wants to win, so it makes sense that he wouldn't want to shut down a restaurant. He wants to keep going and make it a success. But that realization that, well, not only is I need to be realistic about the prospects of this venture, but I have to be fair to what is this meaning from an experience standpoint. If it's stagnating, then they're not going to be able to grow. They're not going to be able to get the experience. And so it's almost a false kindness to keep it open, because we're giving them a job but no future. And it's a tough situation. And he ultimately he helped them find other jobs. He did some amazing job fair type things. It was really progressive. But he did have to, I think, learn some lessons there.
Christian, I think you nailed it on the head. And it's something, I think, when people understand this, that when you hire someone, they don't want just a job. They want a job and, as you said, a future.
Right.
And those people that figure out how to give a job and a future, they win far more than those who just view it as a job.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah. So we should go back and just touch on kind of one of our favorite little stories was his advice from his grandfather. He was complaining one day, I think it was his grandfather, and he was complaining at dinner. It's a family that did a lot of eating, and Danny had the luxury of going to lots of restaurants in Europe and around the United States. But he was complaining about all the things he had to deal with. And his grandfather's like, that's business, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what you do. You get to solve problems. And those that are the best at solving problems and embrace it with some energy and solve the problems faster and more in a more creative manner, they're the ones that win.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
If I can jump in with one more kind of quote that I love, just because we're so focused on employees and the human aspect of business. He had this great quote that says, "Business, like life, is all about how you make people feel. It's that simple and it's that hard." I come back to that quote a lot, that it's really simple, it's easy to say, but it's also difficult to deal with and make a priority when you're faced with, this is what's on fire today. People will take care of themselves, and that it's easy to fall into that mindset.
Yeah. He quotes that quote that you and I both really like by Maya Angelou, the poet, that long after people are gone, they're not going to remember the technical details, but they'll remember how you made them feel. Yeah. And he has this other quote that I wanted to share. He says, "Service is a technical transaction, but hospitality is an emotional transaction, and you need them both." And you say, well, is a company that makes widgets or computer memory, are they in the hospitality business? They might be, right? I think that there is that emotional connection even with their customers. Certainly we see that at Apple Computer and other places where they make the experience more than just a technical transaction. So I like that, and I've really enjoyed this opportunity to really dive into how Danny runs his business, and I've got a lot of respect for him. Anything else you want to add before we close?
No, I just think it's time to go get a double Smoke Shack burger.
Yeah,
that's what I'm thinking about now more than anything.
Yeah, turning this into it's now what a $1 billion business. Yeah, and they're cruising. Well, this is our first case study, and we've had a lot of fun. If you want to learn more about Danny, he's got podcasts and a ton of information out there. We would point you to the How I Built This. The Guy Raz podcast is excellent, as well as search for others. And we hope that this has helped you think about ways you can take this notion of a culture and a culture focused on people, and use that as a competitive advantage in your business and in the business challenges you're facing. So thanks for spending some time with us, and we look forward to our next case study.